I'll take it in groups of 3 or 4.
Okay. Yes, a question to you, please.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. I'm Jacqueline Niven from the Home Office. A question to you. You were talking about human rights abuses in Eritrea, and then later on you talked about prisons, but could you go back and elaborate a bit on what you feel are the human rights abuses there, please? Thank you.
Thanks. Other questions in the room? Ladies over there, and then I'll come to you.
Yeah, I did. I thought they were going to answer the question. Do you want me to do that?
Please, yes, and I'll take sort of batches of 3 or 4.
Hello?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, my name is Clara. I'm a Swedish legal practitioner, but currently a student at SOAS doing a specialized LLM in human rights. My question is for all of the panel, whoever feels keen to answer it. I mean, if I understand it correctly, the subject today is the UK approach to Eritrea refugees, and I feel like left out in this narrative is a little bit the individuals who are actually fleeing Eritrea, their stories, what they've been through, and also how the UK has approached this. Why isn't the Home Office following higher courts' decisions on this? And a little bit elaborate a little bit more on the UK approach to Eritrean asylum applications, and also the stories that are actually coming out from Eritrea, because they should be absolute key to determining whether or not there are human rights abuses going on in Eritrea. Thank you.
Thank you. And lady at the front here, and just loads of hands have all gone up at the same time. I'll finish with the center bit and I'll come to the sides, and then the gentleman here afterwards, and I'll come back to the panel.
Hi, my name is Shobha, formerly of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. I worked on the Somalia operations. My question is for you, Meskina, about, you said that one way out would be if there were a credible opposition in Eritrea, which would make the government more accountable and thereby reduce some of the issues that exist currently with the government. But I just wondered if that was a bit of a catch-22, and if you could explore why there isn't a credible opposition, why that mobilization hasn't taken place.
Thanks. And gentleman.
Thank you. My name's James Sharp from the Foreign Office. 3 quick questions. One was on the border dispute. I'd be interested to know whether the panelists think actually this is resolvable. I mean, we can think of lots of mechanisms, but do the Eritrean authorities actually want to resolve this, or is it quite a useful tool, a lever, to sort of for national kind of solidarity and legitimacy reasons to have hanging there? Number 2 is Ethiopia actually any better than Eritrea in the way they treat their people? I mean, are we kind of victimising Eritrea when actually we should be looking at other countries in the region, including its near neighbour Ethiopia? We know what a lot of people think about Sudan, for example, another neighbour, but what about Ethiopia? And the third one is, can anyone explain to us why there's been such a big reduction in the flows of Eritreans crossing the central Mediterranean this year, which seems to be matched by the number of reduction in Eritreans leaving Eritrea, judging by UNHCR inflow into their camps in Sudan and Ethiopia? We'd love to know the answer.
Thank you. All excellent questions. I'll come for more questions. Let's start with this. Miskin, there were a couple of questions directed to you in particular. Do you want to address them about the human rights?
Okay, the first one is about human rights abuse. Yet there are very serious human rights abuses. And these are conducted by military officials. If one person goes on let's say, a leave for 10 days, goes to his home, and he says that his home been turned to destitute, and then they take 1 month for helping the family. And when they turn back, they are being punished for about 4 years of extra labor work. And there is also some kind of very severe punishment, including corporal punishments. The other human rights abuse is in prison. According to the interviews that I have conducted, some especially deserters and people from Pentecostal churches have been really abused and tortured in prison. One of which that they have told you is they have been put in prison in metal containers, where about 50 are put in one simple container, which is very hard to live on without any medical treatment and others. There is also abuse in terms of sexual abuse for girls that have been in the military service. I haven't found any in my interviews that have been really abused, but they say that there are rumors that have been such abuses. Therefore, there is a real human rights abuses in Eritrea. That's one part. This is the range which I have told you, between 16 and 14. They have witnessed one form, whether it be mild or severe human abuse. Therefore, I can say that there is real human rights violations inside Eritrea. The other question was, I hope I have answered your question. And the other is the UK approach to asylum seekers. Well,
The question was supposed to use about the opposition. Why isn't there a credible?
Well,
you
if
can
I
answer the other ones
that
if you would,
one,
of
okay.
course. Yes.
It's a win-win situation for the Home Office and the Eritrean government. The Eritrean government is engaged in heavy diplomatic campaign to change the narrative of Eritrea. And the Home Office is obsessed by reducing the immigration. Therefore, whatever they are, the Home Office is entirely basing of the discredited reports of the Denmark. The other is the Swedish and the Norwegian reports. Others have said they have come to Eritrea only for 10 days. I have been there entire life, but I haven't known until I come here about the secret prisons in Eritrea. Therefore, if I didn't know such abuses when I was in Eritrea as an Eritrean citizen, how come a delegation that has gone there and been put to the civil prisons, one is the Sambal prison, which is reported by the report, which is the prison for some criminal like theft and others, and they are being treated moderately. Therefore, this is what is coming. It's a win-win situation for them. It's a virtually distorted opinion, according to me. The other is why there is no credible opposition. Well, the opposition is being attacked by both Eritrea and Ethiopia. Eritrea government does not want a credible opposition, therefore infiltrates some people that they engage in making them weak. The other is Ethiopia also doesn't want to see a credible opposition. We have seen the many conferences that have been taken in Ethiopia and then ended up some being cracked and divisions that are arising. Therefore, the Eritrean opposition is being attacked by both. That's why we don't see any credible opposition. The other is was that does Eritrea want to see the border, resolve the border issue? I would say, for the present, I don't think he wants to see that, because the government knows if this border issue is resolved, the Eritrean people will turn over and ask for democracy. Because by nature, as I have mentioned earlier, Eritrean people is a democratic society and want to see democracy. But now, there is a narrative in Eritrea that says, if we crack our unity, then the Ethiopians will invade. And this is the fear of the Eritrean people. Therefore, I would say the same is for Ethiopia. If that border is resolved, then the Ethiopian people will ask for greater democracy and for justice. Therefore, both of them, they don't want to see this one resolved. But what we can, the international community, do is, it's very hard to force Eritrea because it doesn't depend. But we can force Ethiopia because there is plenty of donations that goes to Ethiopia. Therefore, we can say to at least evacuate from Badime, and then we can force Eritrea to go to the table. That is the only solution that we can see for now. The first one is Ethiopia better than Eritrea? I would say it's worse, but the media is not portraying. The Eritrean government hasn't so far, except in 93, was that in 93 and 94, that directly shoot onto the people. But we are seeing Ethiopia that is killing its own people. But the media is not portraying that one. Instead, Eritrea has been said. Relatively, I would say Ethiopia is much worse than Eritrea. And the other is why Eritreans are not coming at this moment. One, the Ethiopian government recently has said that Eritrea has infiltrated many spies as refugees to Ethiopia. And this is one factor. People nowadays, they are hesitating to cross the border to Ethiopia. And the other is the hijacking of refugees in Sudan and being sold to human traffickers. That is reducing the number of Eritreans.
Thanks, Ms. Gill.
Next round, choose 2 or 3 questions, otherwise we can't address them all. Georgina, I just wanted to ask your views as well on the changes in migration flows. What do you think has determined, the question from the colleague from the Foreign Office, if any of the research you've done on migration?
Yeah, and I've heard really different reasons that might be behind this, and have no real ability to kind of verify. One of them being that in November, the NACFA changed, so there was a shift in the currency that meant that people had to declare over 5,000 NACFA, which isn't a huge amount, and that was put in the bank, and so there wasn't the money to change into dollars to facilitate people's movement out of the country. Some people suggest that that was very influential in causing what is seen as a lull in people leaving the country as opposed to any significant long-term change. Concerns at the moment about being deported from Sudan, because the Sudanese authorities have deported a number of individuals from Khartoum. So whether people, again, hard to know whether people have stopped going or it's because people are just going through even more clandestine routes through these countries. Reduced recognition rates, obviously some people will throw that out there, that's kind of stopped people along the way because they don't see Europe as being quite such an easy place to go to. I struggle to believe that one, but I don't really have a way of figuring out. I'm sure it's kind of a combination of all these things. Yeah. Can I quickly say to the question about the UK's response? I think this kind of factors into this idea of a recent shift in thinking around Eritrea is also like being very selective around the data that is being used, and so going to the Danish report when that was kind of went against a lot of other information that was out there. And methodologically, as kind of a side anecdote, thinking about these reports that go in and talk to ambassadors, I was at an event last week where lots of UN staff were there asking about what was going on in Eritrea, and I was like, well, you've been there for way longer than I've been there, and they said, well, our ability to work in Eritrea is dependent on us not asking the questions that we want to ask you, because that's the constraint of our operating environment. So when you read a report that refers on talking to an ambassador or a UN employee, you have to think in the context of the fact that they're not trying to get this kind of information lest it kind of jeopardizes their position within the country. And that wasn't something I think that kind of came through really, or eventually came through on thinking about the evidence for that Danish report. But I presume that even with it being harder, well, on second appeal, lots of Eritreans are getting asylum. It's just now this kind of very inefficient process of going through the first round being rejected and going for appeal, but there are very few deportations because there's always going to be a case there for return to cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment that probably someone could make. So I think it was a strategy to cause a shift in the thinking of Eritreans en route, that it would be easy to access asylum as opposed to being kind of informed by a sense that those conditions were real. Maybe.
Thanks. What I'm going to do is to ask you one of the questions from the very many we've had online, open up for one last round, and then I'll start from Ruby, Martin, and you can address the second round as well as the previous one, and then finish with Meskina and Georgia. So let me ask, it's a question from Vanessa Sander from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. She asks, to what extent is international media responsible for fostering this narrative of Eritrea as a completely isolated country? And how is it the Eritrean diaspora and civil society challenging this narrative? And then I've seen loads of hands. I promised that I would come to the sides. Let me start with the lady there and the gentleman who have been waiting patiently. And if you brief, I'll take as many as possible.
Just turn off, sorry, it keeps doing that.
It's on.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hi, my name is Amal. I'm not really representing anyone. I'm just an Eritrean that was born in the UK and who's so goddamn curious about her country. My question actually was for Ruby. I've interviewed many Eritrean refugees, and the stories I hear are unimaginable, and they're quite, hectic. And to hear that, an alternative approach to the situation which you propose, such as like just leaving them to it, like it's not using sort of a westernized lens to go in, so that really interests me. So I have a few questions for you. So you said that you interviewed an Indian man. I was just wondering, have you spoken to any Eritreans, and what sort of candid questions did you ask? And if you've written an article about it, is it okay if you could just like summarize your findings? And that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman behind.
Thank you.
Okay, it's back again.
Okay, quick. Yeah, thanks. My name's Aiden. I'm a volunteer for Housing Justice, and I'm currently hosting an otherwise homeless Eritrean. I have been for the last 10 months. And with the subject, what's the reality on the ground, my question is not just to the panel, actually, but to the audience as a whole, because the guy that's living with me is 29 years old. He fled Eritrea, went to Sudan, escaped prison in Eritrea, got to Sudan, came over here illegally, claimed asylum almost 3 years ago now, hasn't got it yet. Massive obstruction on the way from the Home Office that was asked by the lady from the SOAS earlier about why that is. But really, it's a very selfish or self-interested question, because I'm sure he wants to live on his own, really, is whether or not there's somebody here who could help us in finding a lawyer who could help us through the mire, because he's had lawyers. The first lot got struck off by the Law Society. The second lot have absolutely dropped him in it. I can go into detail with somebody, but if somebody here could just give me some advice on that route through that,
anyone
then I'd be
come
really
after the event and
please.
speak
Thanks.
to the gentleman. Okay, lady at the front here.
Hi, my name is Ludovic. I'm a journalist from the International Business Times. And I have an observation and a question, actually. My observation is that I don't think it's fair to say that media have not been talking about the crackdown
on protesters in Ethiopia, because actually this is, especially in the past few months, it's been everywhere in the news, and there are credible human rights organizations who have been reporting on the issue. And Ethiopia admitted recently that at least 500 people have been killed since the start of the protest in November 2015. My question is for Mr. Plaut, actually, and speaking about the protest in Oromia, we've been seeing people calling, for greater recognition of human rights, more political and social representation, a stop to land grabbing. Yet Ethiopia has claimed several times that external forces, especially from Eritrea, have infiltrated the protest and are trying to destabilize and eventually overthrow the government. And I would like to know, in your opinion, what is the credibility of this statement, and what are the repercussions of these statements when it comes to relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea and this instability in the region?
Thank you. And I think lady over there and here. Yeah. And then I'll come back to the panel because we've got 8 minutes before the end.
My name is Johanna, and I'm from the Eritrean embassy.
It's fine, just speak close to the mic.
My name is Johanna.
Oh,
I don't know if you can hear me now.
Yeah.
I'm from the Eritrean embassy. My question is to Martin and also the other panelists. My understanding is that Martin hasn't been to Eritrea for over a decade. So do you not think that your findings or your reports on Eritrea are outdated and quite rightly fabricated to a certain extent? And also, when it comes to the EEBC, you are suggesting that there should be a regime change, quite so in Eritrea more than in Ethiopia from your statements. It's a legal binding document, so it doesn't matter if there's a regime change in Eritrea or Ethiopia. It is something that should be abided by Ethiopia. And I don't understand. If you could explain, please, what is the point of coming to the table when it's already been decided and it's legal and binding, and Ethiopia should adhere to it? So I don't understand where you're coming from to say that there should be a regime change in Ethiopia or Eritrea for the stalemate to end.
Thank you. And finally, lady at the back there. It's Lul.
Hi, the name is Seble Ephraim, and I'd like to know or get some feedback that the whole issue about the movement of Eritreans from leaving the country is actually a bigger work than just economic or even the national service issue. Is there a concerted effort that is part of the global agenda on Eritrea? That's one thing. And the other is that it's been covered anyway about the national service, but that's not the real thing, is it? All of the effort that's being done with regards to setting up the commission of inquiry, the sanctions themselves, the SEMG, is that not part and parcel of the whole approach towards Eritrea?
Thank you, Seble. Very last, so please be brief. Please, we've got just 6 minutes left. And then we'll go over.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Brahana Samara. I'm speaking on behalf of Eritrean EU Forum in UK. My point is, human history is a history of migration, and there is a lot of movements from east to west. At the same time, mass international migration is a response to global inequality, and extreme global inequality. That's the main reason. What we see sometimes disturbing me is like Martin Plaut, who was fixed on regime change in Eritrea as coming as if they understand Eritrea. You don't really understand Eritrea. You never been for the last 20 and a half. All you articles is already one-sided. There is war. There is no war, no peace. Situation within Eritrea, and the Eritrean government declared openly, I will isolate Eritrea. I have friends, I have institutions, so there is a war already. And you are part and parcel of that war campaign. I don't know if they pay you or not. The solution now is, there are people in Mediterranean, there are people waiting. We need to think for them a safe journey, a regular journey. We're not going to stop this migration because it's a big issue. There are people, there are Polish people who come here and work, maybe 1 million, 800 million. There are Italians, young people, they come. The number of Eritreans is very few. But what disturbs me is they are suffering because they need a visa. We need to fight for their regular and safe journey. Their right has to be respected. I'm sorry to say that, but there is some kind of racism against the African people, against other people. Sorry. So thank you.
It's okay. Thank you. And one last question from the online audience. Did you have a question to add very briefly?
Yeah, my point is, I'm being frankly for Martin, how can you understand about Eritrea? How can be a solution maker and sit here when you are already one-sided and blindly for the last 20 years? If you, this is an insult to everybody.
Made your point. Let me come to the online question because I want to go back to the panel. Thanks. So there is one other question from of the many I think would be useful to ask from Bashar Ahmed of the Shabaka Social Enterprise, who asks what constructive role can the diaspora, especially the second generation, play to address the challenges in Eritrea? And so let's start with Ruby. Please address any of the questions that you'd like to, and then if anyone has left questions unanswered, I'll choose one of you. I'll go over by 5 minutes. There is wine to bribe you with afterwards, so bear with me.
So the two sort of questions that I'm going to sort of pick up on was the lady from SOAS and also James Sharp from the FCO, and then I'll deal with the others as well. I mean, I was picked up at 4 o'clock and dragged here, and my sort of mandate is sort of business ethics and human rights, and looking at what sort of business can do in terms of looking at the situation in Eritrea, because ultimately they depend on a workforce. They're looking at sustainable mining for the future, or in conjunction with the government. I was in Eritrea, and I gave a lecture to over 500 students at the Asmara School of Science, and it was interesting. I was able to talk quite candidly with them afterwards, and they were young kids, really good English, with a mixture of sort of teachers from different sort of countries, and we spoke very openly, and I said, what's this about sort of migration? Do you have any idea of the perception of your country in the West? And every single one of them knew someone who had taken that dangerous crossing to come over here. And they had done it for economic reasons. Now, please, I qualify my answers. This is my experience of my inquiry. That doesn't denigrate that there are human rights violations. I'm sure they are. Every country has its issues. But when I spoke to them, this was everything from, well, we don't want to go into national service. We've, in a state of emergency. They look at my sort of, and I, wrote this in an article afterwards. I've got an iPad. I've got a certain way of life, of course. My heritage is Indian. I've seen the way, a certain generation of Indians wanted to come over for economic and as Barani was saying, migration. So that was an interesting perspective. And then I think what worried me was, were they aware of how the perception was in Eritrea? Were they aware of their country's perception in the West? And they weren't, and that worried me. Was there a restriction on the internet? No, of course not. They had access to internet. It was a bit slow. They complained about that, but there were internet cafes, so they had access to that. And when I came back, I put together a panel, and one of the panelists was Indra Kartalozi. She's a Kosovan refugee herself, and she talks about trafficking and the fact that it's a $1 billion industry. Now, I know the government of Eritrea is involved in the Khartoum process, and trafficking is an absolutely, an undercurrent, and it's an awful, malign on what's going on. And what's happening is that you've got trafficking organizations presenting the West and access to the West in a very extraordinary sort of perception. This is a great route. It's not going to, this is how much it's going to cost. And then the stories are horrific. So I don't know whether the stories are through trafficking, and to get asylum, those are the stories that are being used. So they start off as sort of economic migrants, and then they go through these arduous journeys, and they've got to use the sort of violations that they've suffered through trafficking as an excuse. I don't know, but it worried me. So, that was one thing that sort of came up. Now, speaking with over 500 students, then speaking to individual workers at the mine site, and that was your question, Amal. It's the perception I get is it's very different. They're people like you and I. They're frustrated. It's a state of emergency. Now, you can imagine if that we've had skirmishes with sort of Northern Ireland recently, and what's been happening with the sort of terrorism here. I don't know how a poor country sort of can hold itself together, and it has to use the only resource that it has, which is human resources. And so, along with the sanctions and the international attention and the particular narrative, it's not easy to deal with that. So, that's my sort of experience of it. Now, the other thing that worries me, James, you were talking about sort of, the border dispute, and I really do echo what Johanna from the embassy was saying. I mean, as a lawyer, we have a schizophrenic approach. On one side, we're talking about the rule of law, and then we're not asking Ethiopia as guarantors through the UN Security Council to adhere to the cessation of hostilities, the Algiers peace agreement, and importantly the EEBC decision. So I find that a really it's frustrating. So you say patronising? That's an entirely patronising approach that we take. So and particularly because Eritrea did adhere to the the arbitration decision in relation to the disputed Hainish Islands with Yemen. So if I was the Eritrean government, I'd be a little frustrated by the sort of the. No, of course.
Make all the efforts, and actually you find the Eritrean authority himself doesn't want the deal because it suits him not to do the deal. So is there any point in making that?
But that's an extraordinary. But the very statement you make, James, is extraordinary. I mean, it's very simple, as Johanna very simply echoes. It's a decision. It needs to be adhered to. Why are we pontificating about that? But you're.
I'm looking at the clock. I've got 3 more panelists to give their views, but we can take that offline and carry on, over wine.
But I think we should just focus on the fact that we should, get Ethiopia to adhere to that, and then see what happens. But to pontificate and extrapolate on something like that is just, it's extraordinary. So forgive me for being quite sort of candid and direct about that. I just find it frustrating as a lawyer that, there's a judgment, there's a decision, and that where there should be compliance. Forgive me.
But your question is not relevant because according to
okay, let me come to Mars. Do you have other questions? Briefly.
So, yes, no, it's interesting, and that we were talking about sort of credible opposition. I mean, we've got to be sort of real here. I mean, about I think 8 or 9 years ago, I wrote a white paper on Singapore and the fact that there was no credible opposition to Lee Kuan Yew, and Dr. Sun Juan-chi at the time was a pro bono client of mine. And so I think we have this extraordinary sort of approach that, even first world democracies don't have legitimate sort of, opposition. And we're being quite sort of, I think we just have to be very, real, pragmatic, engaged and constructive. But please, let's not apply a very binary approach to it. And forgive me, James, if I have misinterpreted. I'd like to speak to you afterwards and just sort of clarify that. So apologies.
Thank you, Martin.
Well, where to begin?
I don't know, but I, choose.
I will, but I hope you will give me the time to honestly respond to some of the points that have been made. I think that if we want to get a feel for what is actually happening in Eritrea, we can do much worse than reading the 2 reports that have been produced by the UN Commission of Inquiry on Eritrea, one of which is over 500 pages. It is vastly detailed, and it is first-hand accounts. None of these were taken, of course, inside Eritrea because the Eritrean government refused to allow the commissioner to come and continues to refuse to allow them to come to take any evidence. And that makes quite clear that the clients that you represent, and do it very accurately and very well, I might say, are involved in some absolutely appalling atrocities. There are allegations against them which will now be tested in a Canadian court which has taken some of the people who were forced to work in appalling conditions, they say, in the mines that you represent, and that they are now taking it before the courts, and we will see what the Canadian courts, whether they believe them or they don't, and this will be a judgment, and I hope it'll come out soon. I mean, the UN Commission of Inquiry found Eritrea, after this incredibly intense process, guilty of crimes against humanity, which is the most serious possible finding that they can find. Now, let me just get on to a couple of the other points. You asked, James, about the relationship and what could be done to improve it, and can it be improved? I think that it can. It will be incredibly tough to do it. But one of the things that I'm extremely worried about is the Khartoum process, which the British government has now signed up to. The Valletta Agreement, which was brought in, includes that there should be training to African law enforcement and judicial authorities in new methods of investigation and, quote, assisting in setting up specialist anti-trafficking and smuggling police units. Now, if I think of the sharing of information between Interpol and Frontex and some of the regimes, whether they are the Sudanese regime or the Eritrean regime, I am extremely worried about what is going to happen and what is going to happen to the people, the poor people who are trying to get through those grasps if they are now assisted by them. So I think that is very, very worrying. On the point that was made by Ludovica about the external forces, what is the relationship and how does that work? And what happens when the Ethiopians point the finger at the Eritreans, which they have done. They point the finger, as they always do, at Egypt and at Eritrea for being behind everything. Would the Eritreans like to be behind everything? I'm sure they would. Are they doing it? I'd be very doubtful. I don't think the Eritrean government has the ability. They have infiltrated people across the border. They have sent arms and equipment, but I don't think they are behind it. I think the Oromo protests are entirely self-generated, and so are the Amhara protests. So I don't think that is the issue. On the question that was raised about the border, let me make it absolutely clear to you. I know the Eritrean embassy may not like it, but I nearly lost my job at the BBC because I was the first journalist to break the story that, in fact, Badme had been awarded to the Eritreans and not to the Ethiopians. Because the Ethiopian foreign minister, and I tell this story in my book, had in fact just made a press conference in which he got up and he said, "We have won. We have had the adjudication in our favour." And I then got information from the United Nations, from a United Nations colleague, who told me this was quite wrong. And it was absolutely clear that the Eritreans were in the right, and particularly on the question of Badme, they were given the adjudication. And the Ethiopian information minister was sent over here to get me sacked. Thank goodness the BBC stood by me, and I was able to tell the story. And I still continued in my job. But don't think that I don't believe that Badme belongs to Eritrea. I certainly do. I stand by the Algiers Agreement. I stand by the ruling. I have always done so. It is entirely right. The Eritreans are completely in the right on this. And it is a travesty that more pressure hasn't been put on the Ethiopians. And there's a very simple reason for this. The West needs Ethiopia. They don't need Eritrea in the same way. You could not have the situation even remotely as stable as it is in Somalia, and it isn't stable, if it wasn't for the Ethiopian presence there. And that is the reason that they support them. It's part of the war on terrorism, and everybody knows that's what's behind it all. Finally, let me just say that I would love to go back to Eritrea, and I will do so with great joy when a democracy is in place. I will be the first person on the plane, believe you me. But when I began in the 1980s working on this, for one reason only, and that was because a tall young Eritrean who was a representative in this country of the EPLF came to see me. I was working with the British Labour Party. I was the Africa Secretary. And he came to me and he said, "You must come to my country." I came twice during your War of Liberation. I came under bombardment from the Ethiopian tanks and artillery. I came under attack from the air. I didn't complain. I was very pleased to do it, and your people were incredibly brave in what they did, and I stood with them. I took that much risk. They took vast amounts of risk. But his name is Ermias Debesai, better known as Papayo, and he has been in jail for at least 17 years. He has never been before the courts. He is in appalling conditions. He's probably dying. Why doesn't your government at least have the grace to release him or put him on trial? You've never tried him. God knows what you have against him. It is an appalling travesty of justice, and he's just one person, and there are thousands in your jails. And until he's freed, I will never stop working on Eritrea, because it's appalling. It's not personal. It's not. It's the hundreds and thousands of people that are documented in the UN Commission of Inquiry. But I know personally one, and I will never forget him.
Okay, your approach hasn't worked, so maybe we should try a different approach this time. I mean, it's been 17 years. Sorry. Yeah, so maybe we try a different approach towards Eritrea.
What, you want to take him out and be shot?
But no, I'm talking about
what is
the
your approach then?
The approach of sort of the international community recognizing their responsibilities. One would be the border issue. Two,
underlined
the
that.
sanctions. The sanctions have been proven to be based on false accusations. So this shows quite evident that the international community, like you say, is not willing to help Eritrea's problems. In fact, might be a root cause to Eritrean refugees. So if UK wants to understand it, maybe it would be a good idea to target the problem from the root rather than the branches. One would be the border issue and the sanctions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Keen and Georgia, and if you can be brief, that would be great.
I would like to answer the question about the role of the second generation in normalization of the diaspora. Yeah, even the first generation are doing some sort. We're seeing that in America, the Ethiopian and the Eritrean diaspora are convening to discuss problems between the two countries at grassroots level. I hope this will flourish, and we, the grassroots diaspora, maybe can put pressure on the government to normalize the situation. But I haven't seen that much participation from the second generation, whether it be Ethiopia and Eritrea. So I hope one day they will join this movement that is going to normalize the relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea.
Thank you. George.
Yeah, in response to the question of is the media responsible for fostering a narrative of Eritrea as isolated, I can only really speak from when I first went there a couple of years ago, when people were still reporting on this kind of lazy North Korea of Africa image when there was all kinds of news that was being reported, and that clearly wasn't a reflection of what was going on there. And so I don't know how much longer before that point these were just kind of misrepresentations of what was going on in Eritrea, but at least for the last couple of years I feel like that's been the case. Then on the formal and safe routes, I completely agree with you. I think that one of the cool things potentially, though at the moment unrealizable, that the EU is trying to do is to open up more visas for skilled, talented individuals. I think that would require investment in tertiary education in Eritrea to make sure that individuals can capitalize on those opportunities. I don't know how feasible it's going to be, but it's kind of one option that's been put on the table as kind of a response. And then finally, in response to this, what is the reality on the ground question, which was at the heart of this, I think that the problem is that we kind of end up always going back to the reality when Eritrea is infinitely more complex than that. And even the stories of individuals who are leaving, these people end up going back, boarding the planes as refugees to see family that they want to re-engage with. And they're leaving for a spectrum of reasons which completely cause a headache for the people who tried to compartmentalize forced migration into lots of different types. And so that means that complicates this. What is the status of these individuals when they arrive? Because for some people who don't mind working in the national service, for other people that's seen as degrading or undermining their dignity. And so different people are experiencing this situation in very different ways, like they are in all kinds of global situations. This is not kind of unique to Eritrea, though there are specific components of that are. But I think it's recognising that, I guess, is the crux.
You wanted to add one last thing?
About the visa. I agree with you. But on the other side, the Eritrean government has also to release exit visa for those who are demobilized. Till now, there is no that option. Therefore, the only option for the Eritreans is to cross the border. Therefore, we have to see it from both sides. The Europeans or any other international community giving visas, and the Eritrean government releasing visas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the panelists and the audience. I knew this would be a rich debate. I'm sure would have, could have carried on for a lot longer. For those who want to stay, we can definitely, carry on informally over wine. George, I think you summed up the debate really well and the complexity of the situation on the ground and how easy it is to paint it with a broad brush one way or the other. I have had the privilege of traveling to Eritrea several times, and I've always been struck by the emotions and the passions, that drive, through everyone, depending on what side they're on. I mean, the Eritreans can be, pro-government, against the government. There is one thing that very much unites them, and is the pride in the history of Eritrea, in what they've achieved, in what they've done, the contributions that they want to make to, continue to strengthen this relatively young nation in every way possible, whether they are in Eritrea or outside. And so I do believe, that we do need as internationals to engage constructively, to, try and use every opening to continue to support a country where, there is such incredible people. Wherever they go, Eritreans are a success story in what they managed to achieve. And I think that's a credit to all of you, and it's for us to support your journey. But thank you very much. Join me in thanking the panelists. Oh, and there are copies of Martin's book for those who want to buy it. And Martin, I'm sure will be very happy to sign them. Thank you. Thank you.